Basically, what I've done here is put together a 4-year history and a 2-year projection of your general fund. And we do it separating it out, of course, revenues on one side, expenditures on the other. I'm going to concentrate in remarks here on simply fiscal years 12 and 13, the current year and next year. Keep in mind that we are currently in fiscal year 12. We're coming up here with a total, $17,649,000, say $650,000 in fiscal year 12, and $17,631,000 in fiscal year 13. Essentially the same. We're showing a slight bit less, but very, very little when you look at this kind of total. You have one other point of revenue here, and that's $1,400,000, which is cash flow borrowing for the current fiscal year. This money was borrowed this year, and it has to be paid back in this year. In other words, no later than June 30th of 2012. So it shows here as revenue, but keep in mind when we go on down, you're going to see it again as expenditure. So as far as looking at your overall picture, it's essentially a wash, because it's coming in and it's going out the same amount of money within the same fiscal year. The only thing that's different about it is there will be some interest that comes into play. Not an overwhelming amount of money. I'm finding also, I should point out, that what I came up with here in revenue, I used the certificate from the Budget Commission, what we refer to as the amended Certificate of Resources, settlement sheet from the Department of Education, and other items that the Treasurer routinely has to come up with the total numbers on revenue. When we come on down, then I'm doing the same thing, and I was pointing out before I started to that basically I'm coming up with numbers here that are very, very much like what the Treasurer has here. We didn't find ourselves in very much disagreement at all. Not at all surprising if we come up with different numbers. What would be shocking is if I came out just exactly what the Treasurer said. The only explanation I could think of is that I just simply copied his numbers. I can assure you that's not the case here. But we usually look at these things and are very pleased when the numbers don't vary very much, because then it's not pointing out some specific problem that we have to go back and start digging and looking for. I fully expect every time I do a financial analysis that one of the things I'm going to do is corroborate the numbers that already exist. And that was true in talking to Mr. Ohm here. We come down then and we look at revenues, and once again I've gone a little bit too far. Salaries and benefits, of course, are the primary things on your area of expenditure. And this is true not just in Monroe, but in every school district. The bulk of the expenditure goes for salaries and personal individual benefits. And schools are very much a labor-intensive business, and there's no surprise when we come up with this kind of number. Sometimes those numbers get to be too high, and they take too much of the available revenue, and therefore there isn't enough to do the other things that you have to do. These numbers don't really seem to be particularly out of line. They're pretty reasonable kinds of numbers. There are also, when we come on down, there are also some salaries in this purchase service category. In most school districts, that's the case, because you might, for example, have a contract with the Education Service Center. Part of that contract almost assuredly is going to be some salaries, and those would be included in the billing, and so they get put onto your revenue sheets as an expenditure here, a 400 expenditure instead of the 100 which you would normally have for salaries. Nothing unusual in that particular situation. We look at personal services, purchase services, materials and supplies, and capital outlay. And then down here, other. We don't have that category in there. It's again, not a major category in this overall picture. And once more, I'm not finding that I'm in any kind of serious disagreement with these numbers on the ones that already exist. But when we come down here, you can see, I don't see the number here, it's 6.01, is that right, Roger?
Yes.
You see the line here with the two numbers in parentheses, meaning that they're negative numbers. This line compares revenue with expenditure. And what it's telling me is that for this current year, the projection says you're going to spend $766,000 more than what you're taking in, or what you're projecting to take in at this particular time. And moving over to fiscal year 13, the same situation occurs, except we're now looking at $491,000. So in both cases, we're anticipating more money going out than coming in, which obviously it can be sustained at a particular time because of a balance. It obviously can't be sustained over time, because sooner or later it's going to lead to a pretty significant deficit. In your case, unfortunately, I think it's sooner.
Keep scrolling down a little bit because that doesn't capture all of it.
Well, you're right. There's another down here.
1.4 million there yet too.
Yeah, now you see there's the 1.4 million I made reference to earlier. This is where we're showing that it's going to be paid back before the end of the fiscal year. We come down here now and look at total expenditures. We divide these into operational and non-operational, and advances and paying back loans and all those kinds of things are in what we call non-operational expenditure. And obviously we have to put them both together. And now we have another line here where we're comparing receipts and expenditures. And you can see in this case, we're talking about $1,664,000 of expenditure in excess of revenue. So not a good number. Same thing, just slightly less, true over there in fiscal year 13. When we bring these on down, the balance at the beginning of the year, and this is something you might want to keep in mind, but for our purposes right now, we're looking at $271,381 for the current year. If we look at the fact that we're going to spend more than we take in, and that shortage was more than that beginning balance, obviously, it's going to lead us to a deficit at the end of the fiscal year. And that's exactly what we're looking at here. The same thing when we move across to fiscal year 13. This time you see the numbers on the fiscal year 13 side being bigger, because we're going to open the year with a negative balance, where in the past you've moved a positive balance across. So you start with a hole, and you're already projecting to spend more than you take in, so of course the balance at the end of that year is going to be even greater, or the deficit balance. There are a couple other things that come into play, and I think I've noted a couple of them in here, but you had a study, a fiscal study done by Baird, I think the company is, and they went through and reviewed a number of things and produced some number of results for you. And this is showing a discrepancy or a possible misposting of funds in fiscal year 11 to the amount of approximately $1,400,000. If this is the case, and if depending on exactly what's found there and exactly when it has to be paid back and how it has to be paid back, that is another additional amount that's going to have to come off of the fiscal year 12 and then subsequently the fiscal year 13 totals that we're looking at here. It isn't my determination to tell you that, okay, we have some monies that were expended out of your bond retirement fund that should have come out of general fund, and you immediately have to do this and this and this to cover that up. I'm sure the state auditor will be not the least bit bashful in telling you what you have to do in regard to that, but that's the auditor's job, and hopefully not an attorney general's job to make a determination here of just exactly what it is that you have to do. But it certainly would appear at the present time this figure will very likely be increased by approximately $1,350,000 to cover transfers to Fund 002. And this is essentially the amount that would appear to have been expended improperly out of the bond retirement fund. And at some point, if that's the case, it would seem certainly that's going to have to go back. We were discussing very, very briefly here before we get started that might be over some period of time. This could be considered a loan which you've made to yourselves from one fund to another, and it could be paid back on a more extended period of time. Again, I would assume at the time of audit you will have some further, rather direct instruction on how and when that kind of thing is going to have to happen. I don't think it's a question of if. I think it's a question of when and exactly how, what the process is to get that accomplished. But it brings us down to the place where if we put that together with the projected deficit, we're looking at a very serious shortfall in your funds. And you've already recognized some of that in looking ahead and seeing that there's going to be a cash flow problem at certain times as you go through the fiscal year, thus the $1,400,000 that was borrowed to cover that particular situation. It's not that unusual if a district is getting down to where things are running very tight, that in the December, January time, it's probably most common. You find that you just don't have enough cash on hand to cover those things that have to be done. You're going to have cash coming in, you're going to get your real estate settlement for the second half of the fiscal year, and that comes in, you know, not on a monthly basis, but it comes in several settlements over a 2-3 month period. So in a sense, it comes in quickly, but not soon enough to cover that cash flow need. And in this case, it looks like not in large enough number to cover the overall need in the general fund itself.